thank you to everybody who's put where they're from and what their role is. I really appreciate it. And please take our survey for us. That has information to help us keep our PIC grant and helping parents with information we need from you. So we appreciate that.
All right, I'm still trying to manage chat so I can see all of this as well.
Okay.
So lots of teachers I'm seeing are here. Early education, early childhood.
Oh, it's just a lady talking.
Oh, Auntie?
Yeah.
Okay, so we can go ahead and get started. Can you see the comprehensive evaluation slide? Okay, so I'm Jen Dupuis. I'm a school psychologist in the Trona County School District. I'm also a board certified behavior analyst. So I was asked to present on comprehensive evaluations. And so most of this is written geared towards parents, but I think I see we have mostly educators here from what I can see in the chat. I think I exited while some of those were coming in. So I can see Carol, Trisha, Heather, Lori, Haley, Charmaine, and Gloria. If you're in here and I didn't say your name, would you repeat where you are and what your role is, just so I can get an idea of who we have here? Thanks, Michelle. So just a little bit about me. Like I said, I'm a school psychologist and a board certified behavior analyst. I've been in education for 16 years in a variety of roles. In addition to my current role as a school psychologist, I've been a special education and general education teacher, autism and behavioral consultant, and the clinical supervisor of a behavior clinic. I do have 2 sons who play hockey, so when I'm not working, I'm usually running from practices and tournaments and camps throughout the year. Keeps me pretty busy. So today for comprehensive evaluations, we want to start by defining what it is and why it's important. Talk about the process that we utilize for a comprehensive evaluation. We'll talk about different areas of evaluation. I'll go over common and less common assessments. This is a part that's really geared towards parents, but it's good for teachers to know as well. Is your child making progress? So anything that we can measure, we can know if we're making progress on those things or not. So how do we use the scores from educational evaluations to know if we're making progress? I'll just go over the eligibility categories and how you qualify, and then what parents' rights are if they don't agree with the results of an evaluation. So school difficulty is a symptom of the problem. So what is the purpose of a comprehensive evaluation? If a student is struggling in class and the teacher observes that he's off task talking with his peers socially when it's time for class discussions and isn't able to respond correctly when called on by the teacher, we need to get to the bottom of what's causing that. So The problem is often obvious. So we have a lack of engagement with the learning material, but what's the cause? And a comprehensive evaluation should identify or make a hypothesis of the problem. So since we have a lot of educators here, what are some potential problems that we should be thinking of when we see a student that's not engaged with the learning, appears to be off task, and is interacting socially? And you guys can just use the chat box. What are some hypotheses we could come to? Any ideas? So one might be, does a student have an attention problem? Thank you, Heather. So do we have problems with ADHD? Is there a processing problem? Are they not hearing correctly? Thank you. Vision and hearing screened. They have ADHD, they don't understand, they can't focus, vision problems. Good, so that could be one area of problem. If it could be another problem with the processing, like a learning disability. So the types of interventions that we would use for a learning disability vary quite a bit from those for a student who has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So it's important that the comprehension or the comprehensive evaluation answer that question. So why is the cause important? Knowing the cause helps lead to empirically based interventions. So if a student has ADHD, we may be looking at chunking assignments, frequent short movement breaks, reminders to stay on task, eventually looking towards a self-monitoring program and reducing distractions in the environment. If the results of the comprehensive evaluation tell us a student has a reading disorder, the interventions look very different. So we may be looking at evidence-based interventions, including phonemic awareness, a structured sequence phonics approach to word reading, substantial time with decodable books, pacing, and introduction of phonics sequence based on the student's mastery with the previous learned skills. If we have a visual processing problem, we would need vision screening, potentially corrective lenses, work with an OT on visual processing activities, accommodations and AT devices to provide visual structure when reading. So when your evaluation team does a comprehensive evaluation, getting to the cause of the difficulty is very important, as you can see from the vast difference in interventions that we would prescribe. So what is a comprehensive evaluation? So it's different for every child. What one child may need evaluated, another one does not. So it is an evaluation in all areas of identified need. It's conducted and interpreted by qualified professionals in their respective areas. And the hypothesis of the cause and recommendations for interventions and accommodations should come with that comprehensive evaluation. What it isn't, it is prescribed based on eligibility category. That was an old way of thinking where we, if the student has ED, has an emotional disability, these are the tests that should be administered for his or her reevaluation. We don't really use that disability category to drive the decisions of evaluation. We look at what areas is this child demonstrating need. And a comprehensive evaluation also is not just evaluating in every possible area without reason or justification. That's not a good use of the student's time or the resources that we have at the buildings. So the process for conducting an evaluation starts with what? And again, because we have teachers here and I'd like to involve the audience, what does that usually start with from in your current role? And go ahead and use the chat box to indicate how that begins in your setting. So with a lot of early childhood, you guys are probably getting the very first referral for the evaluation from physicians, perhaps parents themselves from screenings. At the school system, we often start by reviewing all available records. Okay, thank you, Kim. I'm reading your response here. So it starts with a screening at which a possible delay is identified. And if they're already in preschool, it would start with formulating a plan for what needs to assess and getting parent permission. All of our kids have developmental screenings at the beginning of the year. Great. So we have developmental screenings at the elementary level as well. So we have their universal screeners that all students are using. And then, so we have that available to our records. And then Jennifer's saying pediatricians, it was a screening for hearing and then for speech. So we do need to start by looking at all the available records, any previous evaluations. When I get a new referral, I go all the way back to those preschool referrals and what was initially identified as part of the problem. Many times by the time we get into the elementary age, we need to be looking at other eligibility categories because ours often have, or the preschool ones often have the developmental delay category, and we have to move away from that by the time they turn 10. I also look at the behavior logs. I look at the current and previous IEPs and begin identifying areas to evaluate. So the leader of the evaluation team should contact teachers and service providers to get input on potential barriers to education and additional areas to test. So from that example earlier, if we're describing a student that's off task, often in the area of reading, we'll really want to look at their reading skills as well as their skills in relation to ADHD characteristics. So those are things that trigger us to do further evaluation. The next step in the process, observations should be conducted prior to as part of the evaluation to rule in or rule out hypotheses. And observations are required as part of the specific learning disability criteria. Is it common in early childhood to do observations in their educational environment or home environment? There's such a long delay in the chat responses showing up for me. Well, we can come back to the topic of observations, but those are, I think, a thing that unfortunately often gets skipped because it's only required for the specific learning disability criteria. But that observation really does help to identify, is a student off task? When is the student most off task? Is it independent work, whole group? How are they when they're working with peers? Those types of things really help lead themselves towards the interventions that are necessary. So the process for evaluation, after we've implemented the observation and interviewed all the team members. Parental consent is collected on the proposed assessment areas and adjusted based on that input. So parental consent must be obtained for any new assessments. According to the state of Wyoming, evaluations conducted by record review do not need signed parental consent in the state of Wyoming. So that's pretty rare that those are conducted, but if we are in a position that we can't get a hold of the parents and have to meet educational timelines, those kinds of things do have to happen to keep the student current in special education. So the process for evaluation in regards to the timeline, an initial evaluation, if the student does not have a current IEP, we have 60 days to complete that after the team has received signed consent. And for the reevaluation, no more than 3 years to the day of the previous evaluation. So this is a screenshot right from our state form of the identified areas for that the team proposes to assess. And so they have a number of assessments listed here, and then a position to write others. And then we'll go into talking about some of these areas of evaluation. So some common assessments are the cognitive assessment, which is a general intelligence test or an IQ test. Academic tests are also very common. Communication skills, social emotional functioning, and fine motor skills are common, but less so than the first two. The first two are almost always part of a comprehensive evaluation. It'd be hard to defend why those would not be in there. I did have a student last year who suffered a spinal cord injury, and prior to the injury, she was performing in the average range on all of her IQ tests, or not her IQ tests, but all of her academic tests. And she sustained the spinal cord injury. And when she returned to school, there was no reason to suspect that anything cognitively had been impacted given the results from the medical doctors. So at that point, we did not put her through additional IQ testing, but we did look at all the other areas, how her academic performance was now that she had been out of school. The student did not previously have an IEP. But that's in my time as a school psychologist, that's the only time I can think of that we haven't done a cognitive assessment. So common assessments for cognitive assessments. There's 4 areas of cognitive functioning, which are generally believed to be make up your IQ. The WISC is the most common IQ test that's used in the schools. It tests 5 of those 7 areas. It tests the first 5 that are listed here. So verbal comprehension, fluid reasoning, visual spatial processing, working memory, processing speed, auditory processing, and long-term storage and retrieval. I'd like to go through each of these areas individually because interventions and accommodations can be recommended based on the results of each of these assessments. So if a student has a low verbal comprehension score, the first thing I do is involve the speech language pathologist for additional testing. So verbal comprehension is assessed by looking at the student's ability to define words and to indicate how 2 words are similar. So if they are not able to do that, or they're not, and this is all done verbally, no pen to paper type responses. We just ask them to define words, and they have to give real solid definitions of what makes up that word. So if we say, what is a mouse? That's one of the words, and we have to indicate it's a small animal and some type of characteristic for it. If they can't do that, it's an indication that there may be further needs in verbal comprehension. And when verbal comprehension is low, we are going to see difficulty across a variety of contexts. So they may really struggle in class lectures because they don't have the vocabulary to keep pace with the content. Same thing with reading comprehension. If they've developed adequate reading skills, their independent reading may not have, if they like adequate just decoding actual word reading skills, they may have difficulty with comprehension. That also goes into math problem solving. So being able to solve math problems when there's reasoning involved and words involved can be very difficult. Fluid reasoning. Sometimes we call this the intelligence that you're born with. Another name for it is your nonverbal reasoning. So given images and patterns of unknown structure, can you fill in the piece that would be missing? So they're given a matrix or an array, and they have to be able to identify which picture would complete the matrix or array. When this is low, we often want to be really looking at problem solving strategies, such as teaching them to find a pattern, teaching them to work backwards, teaching them to solve a simpler problem. We often see difficulties with math problem solving when the fluid reasoning is weak. So really, when we see this, we should see some recommendations as a result of the comprehensive evaluation in those problem solving strategies. Visual spatial processing. So these are images that they have to put together to match a model, or there's a puzzle and they have to choose which items go together to complete this puzzle, or if a certain item is turned in different ways, which one would it be, things like that. In the classroom, we see this as if you're strong with visual spatial, strong ability to understand graphs and tables, to line things up on paper. If you're not seeing a strength in visual processing, this is a clue to me to often make sure I have included the occupational therapist. The occupational therapist assessments really split up the visual, spatial, and the fine motor, and then together look at how those two things operate as one. So they isolate the visual spatial, isolate fine motor, and then look at them all together so that, again, we can come up with interventions for visual spatial processing and fine motor concerns. Working memory is very different from long-term memory or memory in general. It's often something that is confused. Your working memory is your ability to keep information in your head and then to make use of it with as you need to. So the tests, sometimes we give a string of numbers and then the students have to say those numbers back to us, but put them in numerical order. Or they may see a string of pictures and have to put them in the order that they just saw them in. Or we'll put animals into little boxes like we're at the zoo, and they have to put them back to the box where they came from. Working memory is a very important skill for learning and just overall functioning, especially executive functioning in the classroom. Teachers often give multiple step directions and then have the students just go for it. And then if you're observing in that classroom, you will see that they end up repeating those directions several times. Lots of students, either maybe they weren't paying attention, or maybe they really are struggling with working memory. There's two parts of working memory. One of them is called your visual spatial sketchpad. So that's someone who has a really strong ability to do that. An extreme example of that might be the like a photographic memory. I can remember exactly what I saw or where I saw it. That's a hard thing to train if it's not already there. But the phonological loop is the other area of working memory, and that's saying something over and over to yourself in order to convert it to memory or to put it somewhere so that you can use it. So I often tell parents and teachers, if a student has a low working memory and it's on the auditory side, when you're giving directions, make sure you have obtained the child's attention and then list the directions. I usually pair a visual with it. I need you to put your paper in your backpack, open your math book, and get your math folder out. And then I encourage teachers to have their entire class then repeat that back to them. What are the 3 things I just told you to do? By just practicing repeating something so you remember it, you're starting to engage and develop that phonological loop. And we do it all the time when we have to remember something. If I'm making an appointment and I need to put it in my calendar, I'm saying it in my head as I'm putting it into my calendar. It's important skill for kids to learn, and often they don't develop it by themselves. It doesn't occur to them to engage that phonological loop. When I'm testing kids, when we do the picture span, those who have developed that, I'll observe them saying box, umbrella, kite, box, umbrella, kite. And then once the new picture emerges, they're able to remember what they had said. Working memory is also important just for that reading comprehension, keeping in mind the things that had just happened and how they may relate to the things that are going to happen. It's also very important for longer math problem solvings when students are required to do multi-step math problems, remembering which step you just completed and which one would come next. So students who have poor working memory are typically in need of a great deal of supports and accommodations to support them in the classroom. Processing speed is just how quickly you can work on or how quickly you can complete an automated task. So something that is relatively easy or relatively easily mastered, and how quickly you can get that done. So if a student has slow processing speed, the first thing we want to jump to is extended time. Extended time is a great intervention for, or a great accommodation for testing environments, because we want the student to be able to complete the test. But when we're looking at the classroom environment, we run out of time if we extend time for reading, and we extend time for writing, and we extend time for math. So it's really important to really focus on quality of work over quantity when we have a student who's a real slow processor. Additionally, one of the tests is the coding subtest. So if you see a coding subtest that's low, that's their ability to copy from a code. So there's a code at the top of the page, and they have to match that with the number it goes with. If they have difficulty doing that, they may really struggle to copy things from the board. There are so many options available to us with technology now that, taking a picture of what's on the board, filing it in a file on their computer, there's so many things that can be done to support that. But because the actual copying from the board may really slow their ability to participate in the class. Auditory processing is a skill where it's really lends itself into reading. So it's your phonological awareness skills, essentially. Many of our cognitive tests don't actually test for this area. We really rely on some of the ones conducted by the speech language pathologist to look at that. So if a student's really struggling with the sounds and manipulating the words, they're going to need a great deal of phonemic awareness intervention in order to develop those reading skills. And finally, the long-term storage and retrieval, also not commonly assessed, it's unfortunate that it's not commonly assessed. teachers often say, you know, I think they had that skill on Friday, but then we turned around to work on it on Monday and they looked at me like it was the first time they'd seen the information. So an evaluation that includes that should be used when you hear reports like that from the teacher. Interventions that go along with long-term storage and retrieval. Spiraled instruction is the one I use most. So if the teachers are reporting that, but we don't have an assessment that has been able to identify that, we can still recommend those interventions. So we might work on something and then they show some mastery and then we start working on some other things and then we go back to the previous things. So we continue to review previously learned material to get that to convert to long-term memory. So cognitive assessments are the primary role of the school psychologists. That's the one test that we definitely do exclusively. So those are, your school psychologist should be your expert on that. So does long-term storage and retrieval go along with executive functioning? Would they assess this to diagnose executive functioning? So in order to diagnose or identify needs in executive functioning, I actually use executive functioning tests. The example I know the best is called the Brief 2, and that is administered through rating scales by people who know the student well. And they really dive into the different areas of executive functioning that the student may have difficulty with. It's common, and I would think pretty recommended for that to be conducted at 5th grade. Prior to going into middle school, so that we can work on some of those organization, planning, skills when they are going to multiple teachers. Classroom teachers know their students so much better at the elementary level than at the middle school level, because there's so many of them that oftentimes we are supporting those students through accommodations that we don't know about. But I got to think about that for a second. Does long-term storage and retrieval go along with executive functioning? Executive functioning and working memory are very closely linked. Hold on a second. But it could be part of planning and organizing a task which are executive functioning skills that could be impaired if long-term storage and retrieval is impaired as well. Does that help answer your question, Janelle? Okay, that's a good question. I think I'm going to look more into the relationship between those two. So after the I think they could be looked into as well. Like I said, I think I just need to kind of look at that and do some research on that myself. That's nothing I had really considered. I really thought about more of the relationship between the executive functioning and the working memory. So after the psychologist completes the cognitive assessments, it's really, they should be leaving the team with interventions and accommodations based on how the student performed. So even students who are really low across in their full scale IQ, they often have areas of strength, and using a strength-based approach to say, well, this student really does have great visual spatial processing, does let us know how important it is to provide visuals when we're teaching that individual student. Of course, another common assessment within a comprehensive evaluation is the academics, and those are primarily broken into reading, writing, and math skills. When we're looking at reading, the tests that we do really break the reading skills up and try to isolate them from each other. So the first one, the phonological processing, that's their ability to manipulate the words, putting a beginning towards the end, changing the middle sound, changing a beginning sound. Even the test even has kids say the sounds backwards, which I think is pretty difficult. And sometimes I wonder if I could even do them. But it's really looking at their ability to manipulate the sounds in words and to really hear the different sounds, and that pen is different than pin. And a lot of kids have struggled with that, and they really aren't hearing a difference between those two vowels. And the tests we do really help to identify what areas of strengths and weaknesses there are in their phonological processing. And then it goes into the nonsense word decoding. So how can they take those phonological skills and apply them to unknown words? Then it goes to word reading. So now we're reading actual words, and then reading comprehension. How well can they understand what they read? And then finally, reading fluency. How quickly are they able to read and comprehend? So those reading fluency tests are usually a list of statements, and they have to check yes or no or true or false at the end of them. So it's things like an elephant can fly, no. Birds build nests, yes. So they have to at least have some basic understanding, but we take the complex comprehension out of it to identify the problems with each individual area. So the results of those assessments should, again, really go to drive the IEP interventions and potentially accommodations. So if we've got an older student who is not word reading yet, they haven't developed the phonological processing or nonsense word decoding skills, we will want to focus on those. And then when it comes to reading comprehension, realize that that's really going to be a struggle, because it's difficult to use all your cognitive efforts to decode. And then once they get to the end of the passage, the teacher says, okay, now what did you read? And they are unable to really put the cognitive energy towards both. And that's true for all of us. We can't pay attention to one cognitive task and do another cognitive task simultaneously. So when that happens, recommendations are to really keep working on grade level comprehension, but do it through auditory comprehension. So things that are read aloud to the student while we try to build those reading skills up. And then there's interventions for reading fluency, repeated readings, phrase readings, repeated practice to bring the fluency up if that is what is impacting them in the classroom. When we're looking at disability categories under specific learning disability for reading, we have the student can have a disability in basic reading, which would include the phonological processing, the nonsense word decoding, and the word reading. They could have a disability in reading comprehension or a disability in reading fluency based on how they scored in relation to their IQ, if they qualified under that area or not. For math, there's typically two areas that we are looking at. One of them's the computation and one of them's math problem solving. It's on the tests. It's often called like applied math or math concepts and applications. So again, these tests try to isolate those skills from one another. So computation is just a series of addition, subtraction, multiplication, division tests, and going onward that get increasingly difficult based on how the student is responding. If they're getting them correct, we keep going. And then the applied math the math is more simplistic to complete, but they have to be able to comprehend and apply the right operation to a word problem. And then written expression is really varied across assessments. It depends on the types of assessments that you use. In some tests, we're really looking at expressing ideas in addition to punctuation. And on some tests, it's just looking at expressing ideas. The area of specific learning disability, there is just written expression, specific learning disability in written expression. Spelling, I always look at, because that really, if there's problems with spelling, that's just the other side of the decoding coin. So it's a hint of possible dyslexia, and interventions that would be appropriate for students who have dyslexia would need to be considered, and spelling is part of the comprehensive evaluation that would help us identify that. Back to math, if we're looking at areas of specific learning disability, the two areas are math computation and math problem solving. And then when we're getting into the language assessments, we're really looking at 4 separate areas of language impairment, or of communication impairment. The first one to talk about is language. Again, going back to that IQ test, when we're looking at that verbal comprehension, this is the kind of thing that we're most interested in. What is their vocabulary? Do they have difficulty with syntax? How's their grammar when speaking? Do they have difficulty with expressive language, getting their point across, or understanding what someone else is saying? In my experience, this area is the most difficult one in the elementary schools where I primarily work, for teachers to identify. So we really have to get into the actual assessment to really identify those need areas. It's very common for me to build an assessment plan, conduct the IQ test, realize verbal comprehension is low, and know to include the speech language pathologist. Teachers typically, I think they think of communication and the work that the speech language pathologist does primarily through the lens of the articulation. So that's the accurate, making speech sounds accurately. So that's one area I think of educational improvement that we need to focus on, is being able to identify when a student's really struggling with the language. There are so many implications to how that affects a student in school when they don't have adequate language abilities, from their reading comprehension to answering questions orally to understanding the directions or instructions from the teachers. It can lead into behavior problems for misunderstanding. And I have not yet figured out how to really help people understand when there is potentially a language impairment. I don't know if I know how to identify it either without testing myself. And then the other areas of speech language disability that we're looking at is the articulation, as I said, accurately making all of the speech sounds in different positions and meaning in different positions of the word. So like a medial R would be a student who can't say the word world because that R in the middle of words trips them up. That does lead to difficulties with phonological processing often, and those early decoding skills. Michelle says in the text that she's noticing more articulation errors since COVID, and as a result of virtual instruction and mask wearing. And I would not doubt that. I haven't seen anything on that officially, but so much of what we learn, we learn by watching others. So when we're not able to make the mouth positions and model that for students, it was a really rough year or more, depending on where you were, of teaching behind those masks. And I do think that we're seeing that more and more. I think in the evaluations that I do when I start doing their developmental history, it's now their third grade year or their second grade year was cut short due to the COVID closures. So kids who missed like the first half of, or the second half of first grade and the first half of, or the full, or the second half of first grade. And then we have a lot that stayed in virtual and then they missed second grade. And now they're in third and their level of reading is so far behind their peers. And so we've just have far more tutors working with students to try to bring those skills up. And it's hard then to identify, do we have a disability or did we have a lack of access?
You want to put those shoes back under the thing there?
And since that came up, the disability versus a lack of access to instruction, I think it's important to distinguish the difference and where that decision is made in the evaluation process. If a student is referred to me who missed the second half of first grade and then was in virtual in second, just as an example, as I was just saying, I can't deny that referral on the basis of lack of access. The referral and the evaluation still needs to take place. Where we may potentially say the student does not have a disability is after we're looking at all the results. So it's still important to conduct a comprehensive evaluation, and then it's a team decision as to whether or not the data that we have collected does constitute a learning disability or some other disability, or if this is the result of a lack of access to the education. And hopefully the teams are collecting really strong RTI data within that process. So they're implementing interventions and taking data on their effectiveness, and they're able to report out on that. And if we're not seeing great improvement, I do think that that's a big indicator that the student did have lack of access, yes, but also probably is struggling with a learning disability. If the student did not have a learning disability, we would not be seeing flat progress given evidence-based interventions and that response to intervention method. And I know you guys are in preschool, so, or a lot of you are, so you're not quite getting into that yet, or the lack of access problem hasn't come up yet because they're young and that's not the reason for the disability. But it's a very common mistake that referrals get rejected based on that, but they should not. We should still move forward with an evaluation and reject the placement in special ed if the data indicates that it's not a disability. Did that part make sense? I hope. If not, just go ahead and put some questions in the chat. So another common test that we are looking at is a social emotional test. That's usually conducted with the Behavior Assessment Scale for Children, 3rd edition, the BASC-3. It provides ratings for externalizing behaviors, hyperactivity and aggression and conduct problems, internalizing behaviors such as anxiety, depression, and somatization. That somatizations like physical ailments that are really the result of like anxiety or worry. My stomach hurts, but I'm worried kinds of things. It has some other areas like atypicality and withdraw. And then it has an adaptive behavior scale where things like adaptability, social skills, leadership, functional communication, and activities of daily living are included. One thing well, the pros and cons are on the next slide, but a big limitation to this is it doesn't necessarily lend itself to what we're going to do about it. So often I may have a student who is engaging in some sort of problem behavior. Let's just say it's pushing peers in line. So they say, Jen, we need a BASC and potentially some social work services for this student. So if we know that the problem is aggression, then the BASC is going to tell us the problem is aggression. The BASC doesn't help us design intervention. It shows the manifestation of the problem, but not the cause of the problem. Or we don't necessarily have, oh, when this is low, these are the kinds of interventions that help. So the good things about the BASC are it does compare the behaviors, how they're different or similar across environments. So if one teacher's observing all this aggression, but another one isn't, that may help us to know that there's a problem within the environment, but again, not necessarily what it is. Or there's not necessarily a problem, but a difference. So why is a student successful in this environment, but not this one? Oftentimes the rating scales from home and school are very different, especially for a student with a learning disability and with learning struggles. They may have what looks like ADHD here at school, but the parents don't report anything like that because they aren't, because they're not putting the same kind of academic demands on them that we put on them at school. The other good thing about the BASC is it does compare behaviors to the general population. And so we can determine if the behaviors are significant or if they're just within the average range. So yeah, there's some level of aggression, but some level of that is appropriate. And that might be like verbal aggression, which may be standing up for themselves. Of course, no level of aggression is appropriate in a school setting, but what it compares that individual student to a peer group. And the other good thing about the BASC is it does provide validity index. So it can identify raters who have overly negative or overly positive viewpoints. It can also identify raters that are inconsistent in their response styles. So they may say, there might be a question like, student never does their homework, and they say often, and student doesn't complete schoolwork, and they say never. So just they're not responding the same way on the same types of questions. And those are built in purposefully to identify, to help the test's overall validity. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but another common assessment is the fine motor tests. So does the student need support? And typically that's in the form of a direct service for visual processing, fine motor skills, or both, which is the integration of these two skills. And additionally, occupational therapists are often experts on assistive tech devices and support those students in using them in the general environment. So that can be as simple as pencil grips and slant boards for younger students. And then for older students, they do start to change their goals at those upper elementary and beyond skills from developing that adequate handwriting to moving towards speech to text, word prediction, and keyboarding. I do find that parents at the upper elementary level anyway are pretty resistant to that. They really want this, to some of the high-tech devices, they really want the student to develop adequate handwriting skills and learn to spell without that word prediction software. And it really is a delicate balance between where the student needs to learn skills still and where they do need to produce longer pieces of written work. So we typically kind of problem solve that by in writing tasks that are shorter than 2 sentences or something like that. We are really going to push those spelling and handwriting abilities, but when the student has to produce several paragraphs of writing, we work on those high tech, which is pretty transferable to the real world. If I have to make a couple notes here or there, write a couple sentences to a coworker to complete something, it's common for me to handwrite it if we're in the same environment. But if I'm writing a long psychoeducational report, even if it wasn't a issue of professionalism, I'd much rather be typing that. It's easier to correct mistakes and make edits and things like that. So I think that's a pretty fair balance that we usually strike with parents. Obviously, there's less common assessments. If anybody wants me to go into any of these, you can put it into the chat box. The functional behavior assessment is its own hot topic conversation and something that I'm speaking about at the next session starting later this evening. Physical therapy assessments, those ones are a little bit difficult sometimes for parents and teachers to understand. So a student may need and be accessing private physical therapy, but in the schools, they're really looking at, can they access their environment? Can they access their environment without fatiguing? Can they get out of the building quick enough for a fire drill if needed? Can they get through the lunch line? So they really have to be able to, it really has to be impairing their daily functioning for them to qualify for physical therapy services in the school. More commonly, they will qualify for adaptive PE services. So if they need additional support and goals in PE to be able to make progress on that general curriculum. Then adaptive assessments, assistive technology assessments, health, hearing, autism specific diagnostic tools, transition needs for students who are 16 and up, mobility, which is often along the lines of physical therapy, executive functioning. We talked about that a little bit earlier, just depending on the age and the environment differences for students who struggle with that. I do really recommend working on executive functioning tests, tests that look at the manifestations of symptoms of ADHD and of course others. The amount of tests are limitless, but this is the majority of them. So again, for the process for evaluation, a meeting should be held to review the results of the evaluation, which should include how your child scored, the relation to typical peers, and that's usually done through a percentile. Recommendations based on the results should include interventions, accommodations, teaching strategies. The team should consider and discuss these recommendations and amend or write a new IEP. So just because a test may indicate that the student has a slow processing speed and may need extended time or a focus on quality over quantity, as a team, they should discuss that with the observations that they've seen in the class to determine if that accommodation is actually appropriate. So just because it found itself into the psychoeducational report does not mean it must be in the IEP. It should be, those should be options for the team to consider. So understanding the results can be pretty overwhelming. There's standard scores and scaled scores and T-scores and percentile ranks, and sometimes even additional things like stay nines or Z-scores. These are the most common things that are reported when we're looking at comprehensive evaluation. So I thought we'd go over those a little bit. So the bell curve is a visual representation of a normal distribution of test scores. I have a bell curve on the next slide. Most students perform in the average range. Some perform above average and below, and very few perform in the very high to very low range. It can be difficult for parents to hear that percentile rank, but it can be important. So I do have a friend who has a child with autism, and they have a sense of humor about things, but they say that they go into the evaluations and say, can we just skip the part where you tell me my child's at the first percentile and everything? And for some students, that may not be a great indicator of what they can do. These tests are normed for the general public, so the evaluation team may need to be looking at different types of tests, skill-based tests to look at progress over time, because a standardized test that we give to every ninth grader who is eligible for special ed at their 3-year eval should maybe not be the same one that we're looking at for a nonverbal child with autism, perhaps. But I do think it's important for parents to understand that percentile rank. And I think it's helpful because it helps us to know if the performance and results are actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. So the first reason that it's important to know the percentile rank is because it needs to be in order to qualify for special education, we shouldn't be seeing percentiles in the average range. So if the student was referred for reading, this is just an extreme example, and all the reading scores were at the 30th percentile. And yes, the student is probably struggling a little bit, but the 30th percentile is actually in the average range. We should not turn around then and call that student disabled. So that's one thing that we discuss with our tutor teams here, that even though the student is still kind of below grade level, their score isn't different enough from the norm to be considered disabled. The percentile rank can help the team determine the eligibility category. So, or not the category, but just as special education in general. And then the percentile rank can help parents know, and teachers, if their child's making progress. So this is just an example of the bell curve. I thought it could be a resource for parents to be able to see where standard scores are. That's the very bottom row. Percentile ranks above that, and the stay 9 is above that. The stay 9 is less important to evaluations then, and it's rarely ever used. But this is just a reference page. So standard scores are used for composites. So more than one test together, like 2 different subtests or more, can help you come to a standard score. And the average range for the standard scores are 90 to 110, and scores range from just below 40 to above 130. Very, very, very few, less than 1%, are ever below or above those numbers. The scaled score, those are the results that we get from individual subtests. The average range is 8 to 12, and the scores range from 1 to 16 on a scaled score. And then percentile rank, the average range is actually 25 to 75. So 50% of the population is in the average range. And then scores range from 1 to 99. And the T-scores average ranges from 60 to 40, and scores range from 20 to about 80. They can be higher than that, but they're very rarely higher than that. So I'm putting this in here because I know of a legal case where a district's assessments were used to indicate that the IEP team had not done its job in providing FAPE. So there was a student who entered special education with his, I'm just going to jump ahead to this and I'll come back to it. I think it's not. Okay. Student who'd entered special education with his reading scores right at the bottom of the average range. And the student had the same subtest from the same test given at 4 different reevals through the student's educational career. And the parents because the student was not making progress, his parents had enrolled the student in a private school, which used the Orton-Gillingham approach to teaching reading, and then the student's progress started increasing. So over time, the student's progress went from a standard score of, I believe, the low 90s. So that would be just at the very bottom of the average range. And then every 3 years, they repeated the assessment. And that's not what you're looking at right now, but every 3 years, they completed the assessment. And the student's standard score and percentile rank continued to drop. And the parents filed a lawsuit against the school district to sue for reimbursement from their enrollment in the private school. And they were actually awarded the reimbursement based on the school district's own assessments. So looking at those same tests across time can help us know if we are making progress with the student or not. So I'll slide back and go over that. So often standardized assessments are repeated every 3 years when a student comes due for their evaluation. I often administer the same tests that they were given 3 years prior. Those academic tests are usually chosen by the psychologist, and they choose the one that they like or they're most familiar with or gives them the best information. I personally use the Kaufman Test of Educational Achievement. But as a parent or a teacher, you can request that the same test be repeated. If the parent requests that the same test be repeated, the district needs to consider that request and respond in writing as to why they did or did not use a particular assessment. If we just want to focus in on one area, the one I have in the future slides is the Woodcock-Johnson 4 tests of educational achievement, the letter word ID. All it is a list of words of increasing difficulty, and the student has to read those words until they miss 5 in a row, and then it's over. So it's, if a parent or a teacher said, hey, Jen, I'd really like to see that test done again, it'd take me maybe another 5 minutes to administer that test, in addition to the Kaufman test that I prefer. So it's not a ridiculous request to say, I'd really like to see how they did on that same test that they had done previously, to know if we are making progress or not. If we're not making progress, since we have a lot of teachers here as an IEP team, it is our job to amend that IEP, put in different interventions, conduct additional assessments. It's our job to do something to try to provide an adequate education for that student, or appropriate education for that student. So you can request that the same test be repeated. And again, if it's coming from a parent, we need to respond to them in writing as to why or why not we're not completing that test. If a new version of the test is released, it is unlikely that a request for an older version would be honored. So for example, the WIAT, the Wechsler Individual Assessment Test, 4th edition is somewhat recently out, I think a year and a half, maybe 2 years now. So if a student was evaluated 3 years ago with a WIAT 3, I may not go back and use a test that is now considered outdated. It'd be pretty uncommon for us to do that and not really advised. But we could still look at the differences, as the test often doesn't change too much, but the norming would. So that's one way to be quantifying progress using the comprehensive evaluations. Of course, you guys have lots of evaluations that are done in the classrooms that help to make that decision as well. And then this is where I'm just talking about comparing the results over time. You can compare the results of your own child's test scores over time if the same test and the same subtests are administered over time. I gave that example of the WJ for achievement and the letter word identification test. And then if you were going to graph, this is just an example of a student's progress over time on the letter and word identification graphed by his percentile rank. So we went from around the 10th to around the 20th to around the 30th percentile. So the intervention was appropriate for the student, and this really does help to defend your educational plan should you ever be put in the position to have to do that. So just in general, changes in standard score and percentile rank. If your child's standard score or percentile rank stays the same from year to year, they're maintaining their current rate of progress and their current rank among their peers. So when I write my psychoeducational reports, I often will put tables which include previous scores on the same test and compare those to current scores. So if a student received an 80 last time and an 80 again this time, they are maintaining their current level of progress. It's not that they performed the exact same as they did, but in relation to their peers, an 80 is, what's that? Maybe around the 16th percentile, maybe a little bit lower than that. They're maintaining their current rank. So they would have to make progress on goals in order to do that, but they're not really making as much as we hope. We really hope to change that trajectory by putting a student into special ed. If your child's standard score or percentile rank is decreasing over time, it's likely that the programming isn't addressing his or her needs. The programming should be adjusted. And if it's increasing, your child is benefiting from his or her educational opportunities. And then just qualifying for special education. There's really a two-pronged test in Wyoming. And the first one is they need to meet criteria in one of our 13 categories. And then the second area is the student must be in need of specialized instruction. So recently a 504 coordinator came to me and said that she had written a 504 for a student who had a traumatic brain injury recently, but she was wondering if special ed would have been more appropriate. And probably because the student has a traumatic brain injury, they would meet criteria under the category of TBI. But what is the specialized instruction that is needed for that student to maintain progress? So after talking with the 504 coordinator for some time, we found out that the student has, if she has a seizure or hits her head again, she ends up having huge amounts of regression in her academic skills. And so they have to really back up and make progress. So I said, yeah, we should definitely work on an evaluation for this student, because that is specialized instruction that we're having to regularly change the course of our instruction because of something that's directly related to that brain injury. So that's the two-prong test for Wyoming, is that they have to meet criteria and they also must be in need of specialized instruction. I hear teachers often say when I'm conducting a reevaluation, they'll say to me, did the student requalify? Well, in Wyoming, there's no requalification criteria. There's not like testing that would say the student does continue to qualify or does not. The question just is, does the student still demonstrate need for the IEP? And that's the discussion at the eligibility table, not necessarily if they continue to qualify. And then I just listed the eligibility categories here for your reference. These are the categories identified in the state of Wyoming as our 13 categories. I did put in here steps for parents if they don't agree with the results of an evaluation. So if you disagree with the evaluation of your child, you can request an independent educational evaluation. The acronym for that is IEE. The district must provide you with information about where you may obtain an independent educational evaluation. And it's conducted by a qualified examiner who is not employed by the school district. And it can be provided at public expense if certain criteria are met. And this is spelled out in the procedural safeguards. As IEP teams, it is part of our job to help parents understand that giant packet of information that we provide to them. So when we come to the point with a parent where they may not be agreeing with the results of our evaluation, or they may disagree with a placement recommendation, or maybe an intervention if we're looking at something potentially controversial, like within a functional behavior assessment or something, we have to help them understand what their procedures are, and where they can find those in that document. And that's something that we try to avoid as best as we can by just working with the parents and making changes as things are necessary, so a student can access FAPE, but those procedural safeguards are their rights, and we have designated times we have to offer them to them, and we should help them understand them. So the IEE, Janelle, can be provided at public expense if certain criteria are met.
I'm just not sure what that meant by public expense.
That means the district pays for it.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. That's just, I'm just regurgitating the wording in the procedural safeguards. So thanks.
I just have never heard that verbiage used before, so I appreciate it.
Yep. Parents obviously can seek out an IEE and pay for it themselves, but they can also ask that the district pay for it. And the districts are obligated to under certain conditions. And I don't actually have all those conditions memorized, but they are on page 4 and 5 of the procedural safeguards. And that we've got about 10 minutes left. So were there any questions or comments from the group? Thank you, Gloria. Thanks for coming, Janelle. Appreciate your questions and feedback. Thanks, Heather. Thank you. Okay, if there's nothing further, I'll stay on until 6 o'clock. But it was nice to meet some of you, meet all of you virtually.